What if the Earth remembers more than we do? Not through language, not in stories, not in anything that speaks the way we speak, but in ways that move slower than thought, in rhythms that unfold over millions of years. Maybe the Earth doesn't forget. Maybe it simply carries the weight of memory in stone, in silence, in the soft layers of time laid down like sheets of forgotten dreams. Somewhere in the deep hush of the planet's early breath, before our names, before our footprints, there might have been others. Beings whose bones, if they still exist, lie quiet beneath miles of sediment and pressure. Creatures not made for our world, but for one older, thicker, heavier with atmosphere and sound. They may have walked across warm supercontinents, under skies laced with carbon and mist, in forests whose roots have long since turned to coal. Could it be that once the tallest trees were not the only giants? It's not that the Earth hides these things on purpose. It's simply that she forgets in her own way, slowly, naturally, with a kind of elegance. Erosion doesn't rush. Mountains crumble with patience. The sea rises and falls over eons, swallowing coastlines, whispering secrets into trenches that fold into themselves through the quiet violence of subduction. The crust moves. Continents drift. Nothing stays in one place long enough to be certain. So what if there were giants? Not monsters, not myths, but living things, tall, intelligent, or simply immense in scale. Would we even know? Most life never fossilizes. It dies and vanishes. Soft tissue, light bones, ephemeral traces, they don't last. Unless something extraordinary happens. Unless, by chance, a body falls into a swamp, or is covered quickly by ash, or rests beneath a riverbed just long enough to turn to stone. But most don't. Most become nothing. And so maybe these giants, if they ever lived, were lost not because they weren't real, but because time is efficient. It does not hoard what it cannot keep. It reshapes, reuses, recycles. Even bones, even mountains, even memories. We think of giants as fantasy, as exaggeration, but the fossil record reminds us that scale is relative. The Earth has known trees taller than buildings, dragonflies the size of hawks, and sloths larger than vans. It has grown things bigger, heavier, stranger than our cities would allow now. Different gravity, different air, different balances of oxygen and nitrogen and carbon. The sky was thicker once, the world warmer. The rules weren't always what they are today. Could a different kind of being have risen in those vanished conditions? Something intelligent or aware or simply vast? Maybe. Maybe not. But if it did, it would have lived and died without us. No books, no tools we'd recognize, no language that fossilizes, no bones, maybe, or bones ground into dust by glaciers long since melted, or scattered on the seafloor, beneath sediments layered like soft snowfall for 100 million years. Because time doesn't just erase, it folds, it buries. It layers the old with the new and keeps the record only when conditions are perfect. And how often are they perfect? The deeper we dig, the harder it is to see clearly. Fossils get rarer, rock gets older, and even stone begins to forget. Isotopes fade. Carbon bonds break. The world becomes more silence than story. And yet, there are places where the silence breaks, where footprints remain pressed into volcanic rock, where petrified forests still hold the shape of ancient trunks, where bones do turn to stone, and the air seems to pause as if it remembers something, something too large for words, something almost familiar. We do not know everything. We cannot. Not when the evidence lies scattered across eras too vast for maps, buried in fault lines, hidden beneath oceans that will not give back what they've taken. But maybe the question is not, did giants exist? Maybe the question is, why does the Earth feel like it remembers them? A shape in the rock, a hill that feels like a shoulder, a wind that moves like breath. Not because we imagine too much, but because deep down we remember something too. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to ask, enough to wonder. And if we are wondering, maybe the memory is not gone at all. Maybe it's only sleeping. And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? The Earth, in her deep and patient stillness, does not shout. She does not rush to show us what came before. She speaks in whispers, in fragments, in the broken curvature of a bone curled under layers of hardened mud. Fossils, we call them, stone dreams, shaped by time and pressure, the remnants of lives that once moved, breathed, and fell still. But they are rare, so very rare. For every million beings that walk, swim, or fly across an epoch, only a few are ever chosen to stay. And even those are not guaranteed. The path to preservation is narrow. A body must die just so, quickly, gently, in the embrace of ash or silt or sand. It must be buried before the world has a chance to reclaim it. Before scavengers pick it clean, before oxygen erodes its softness, before it crumbles under the weight of time. If the moment is right, just right, then minerals seep in, replacing tissue with stone, cell by cell, until what once lived becomes a sculpture of its own absence. And even then, it must survive everything that follows. Earthquakes, subduction, erosion, floods, fire, and forgetfulness. So we look to these remains with reverence, not because they tell us everything, but because they remind us how little survives. A single tooth, a shattered femur, a shell curled into limestone, each one a frozen sigh from a world that no longer breathes. We try to build stories from them, piece together the broken sentences of prehistory. This jaw must have eaten. This rib cage must have heaved with breath. This footprint must have touched wet soil beneath a sky whose color we will never know. But what of the lives that left no trace? What of the ones that died in forests where nothing fossilizes, where rot and rain erased all memory before it could harden? What of the creatures made not of bone, but of cartilage or chitin or something softer still? What of the beings that lived not in open plains, but in caves, or high in trees, or beneath the shifting sands of time? Could it be that entire kingdoms passed through this world like smoke, leaving no shadow behind? The fossil record is not a book. It is not even a journal. It is a torn letter, water-stained and half-burned, with sentences missing and meanings blurred. Tells us something, yes, but only just enough to show how much we do not know. We find the fossils of giants who grazed the plains, but rarely the whispers of what they saw. We find the claws, but not the silence that followed. We find the skeletons, but not the dreams. And perhaps that's the deeper truth, that fossils are not really about bones at all. They are about loss, about what fades and what decides to stay. They are the memory that resists entropy, but even they crumble, even they dissolve. Given enough time, even the most perfect fossil will wear down, grain by grain, until it is dust once more, indistinguishable from the stone that surrounds it. And still we search, because to search is to hope. To brush away soil is to believe that something still waits for us beneath the silence. Not because we expect answers, but because the questions are worth holding. What did they see? What did they fear? Were they warm-blooded, cold-blooded, something in between? Did they sing? Did they mourn? And if some of them stood tall, taller than we can imagine, what stories did the canopy keep? What shadows moved through the underbrush when the air was thicker, when gravity was softer, when the world still had places untouched by ice? Maybe we've found some of them already, misidentified, misunderstood. Maybe the bones have been waiting quietly for us to ask better questions. Or maybe they've long since turned to vapor, taken by the wind, carried out to sea. It's hard to know, but we keep listening, because somewhere in the rock there are still fragments, shapes, hints. The earth doesn't forget, not entirely. She just buries her memories deep. And if memory can turn to stone, then perhaps, just perhaps, silence can hold giants. Time, as the earth feels it, is not the same as ours. It stretches, pools. It folds inward, like the grain of a tree's rings or the slow drift of a continent moving less than an inch each year. We measure in hours and days and seasons. But the earth counts in sediments, in silt, in layers of shale and quartz and limestone, each one a chapter not read, but buried. We are used to clocks. But the earth's only clock is dust. and dust, when it settles, remembers. Not in words, not in symbols, but in texture and color and weight. A fine gray veil laid down by a distant volcano. A reddish stratum born from iron-rich floods. A smear of ancient pollen, preserved like a whisper from a forest that no longer stands. Each layer holds a hint of the moment it came from. Each one presses gently against the next, building a timeline too large for language. And within these layers, if you know how to listen, you can hear the faint breath of things that once were. Some are small. Some are strange. Some just maybe were impossibly large. But geological time does not hurry, and it does not always keep its promises. The giants, if they were ever here, may have walked across landscapes now lost to erosion. Their footprints might have pressed into mud now long dissolved. Their bones, if buried at all, may have sunk into ocean floors that vanished beneath tectonic plates, subducted into the mantle, melted and folded back into the world like forgotten names. The earth is not cruel. She is not hiding them, but she has other things to do. She recycles. She reuses. She lets go. Could it be that something immense left its trace in a layer we mistook for ordinary? Could it be that one layer of silt contains not only the dust of rivers and storms, but the last falling ash of a forgotten civilization? Or the wind-blown remains of a skin too fragile to fossilize, but once stretched over a frame too vast for birdsong? Maybe, maybe not. But it is the dust that decides. The dust and the weight of time. Over millennia, sediment gathers like sleep. Erosion softens the edges of everything, reshaping mountains into whispers, cliffs into sighs. Entire landscapes rise and vanish over and over again. What we see as ancient, the earth sees as temporary. What we call ruin, she calls rhythm. And in this rhythm, nothing is static. A rock may be solid, but its atoms move. A mountain may seem still, but it leans ever so slightly into wind, into rain, into gravity's pull. Over thousands of years, the hardest stones surrender. Over millions, they vanish. Giants, if they stood, would not stand forever. They too would soften. They too would fall. And when they did, the dust would catch them. Time, then, measures everything the same way. Not in glory, not in power, but in layers. In what falls and what settles. In what is buried and what remains. The deep strata of the earth are not made of years, but of memory pressed flat. A fallen forest becomes coal. A riverbed becomes sandstone. The tracks of ancient feet become rock. Or they disappear completely, and what disappears is not gone. It is only changed, hidden in transformation, rewritten as mineral, as texture, as silence. Sometimes we find a fragment and call it evidence. Other times we find nothing and call it mystery. Both may be true. There is something humbling in this, something soft. Time does not favor giants or gods or even us. Time simply records, and what it records is not always what we hoped. But what if, in all this silt and all this quiet forgetting, something enormous once passed by? Something that left only the faintest mark. A displaced pebble, a denser patch of clay, a slightly different grain to the dust? Could we see it now? Would we recognize its shape, its story, its breath? Perhaps. Or perhaps it is still buried, waiting beneath a hill we do not think to question. Still sleeping in a seam of rock not yet opened. Still whispering from beneath the layers, too faint for our ears. And yet, if the dust can remember sighs, then what else might it be cradling? Not every trace is bone. Not every remnant is flesh turned to stone. Some things survive not through biology, but through intention, through craft, through accident, through the strange endurance of the artificial. The earth, in her silent patience, does not judge what she buries. She holds on to what falls. And sometimes what falls is not a body, but a circuit, a shard of glass, a thin coil of copper wound tighter than any fossilized rib. What if, long before us, or perhaps long after something else, there were beings not so different from ourselves, walking not with clubs or spears, but with devices we wouldn't recognize? Not giants of flesh, but giants of creation. What if they built and vanished, not with a bang, not with fire, but with stillness, a quiet fade, a long forgetting. And what if all that remains of them is buried now beneath layers of sediment too deep to name? A synthetic polymer fossilized into rock. A ceramic insulator warped by ancient heat. A hint of structured order in the carbon chain, too regular to be natural, too eroded to be explained. Could it be that the Earth carries remnants not just of creatures but of technologies? Technofossils, they're sometimes called. Traces not of bodies, but of tools. The accidental afterlife of things made to serve, now sleeping in stone. In our time we already leave them. Plastics that will outlast our cities. Aluminum alloys that resist decay. Concrete strong enough to withstand centuries of rain. And beyond them, stranger things, microchips, data layers, electromagnetic scars imprinted into the ionosphere. Long after we are gone, these may remain. Evidence of a species that reached into the invisible, then disappeared. So what of others? Could it be that we are not the first to create something lasting? That in a forgotten epoch, before ice, before carbon balance, before our calendars began, another intelligence shaped the earth in quiet ways, leaving only hints behind? Maybe they did not build skyward. Maybe they lived underground, beneath thick canopies or inside walls of stone. Maybe their tools were not made of iron, but of something softer, lighter, stranger. Materials we would miss entirely. Tools that degraded into mystery. And yet, some things leave echoes, not in shape but in pattern. In isotope ratios that seem just slightly off. In layers of sediment where nothing natural explains the distribution. In magnetic anomalies, glassy textures, melted crusts. There are places on this planet where geology itself seems confused, where sand fuses as if caught in a heat too sudden, too focused, too unnatural. These scars are small, quiet, easy to overlook. But they whisper of fire without flame, of pressure without fault lines, of order inside chaos. We often think of fossils as belonging to the past, but technofossils stretch forward. They are not relics of biology, but of thought. They are memory encoded in matter. And the deeper we look into our own future, the more we realize how many of our creations might one day petrify into puzzles. What would a future archaeologist make of a melted USB drive? Its metal fused into slag, its secrets unreadable but somehow deliberate. What would they see in a strand of synthetic fiber wound into a core sample? Would they guess its purpose? Or would they call it an anomaly and move on? Maybe, just maybe, there are already things we've found that we do not understand. Artifacts mislabeled, shapes dismissed, samples stored in drawers, unclassified, forgotten. Not because they aren't real, but because they don't fit. And if we could miss the fingerprints of our own possible futures, how many pasts might already be lost? What if the giants of long ago were not made of muscle and bone, but of silicon and light? What if their cities hummed with quiet energy, not stone walls and iron gates, but networks and signals and silent machines that fell still long before our kind was born? Could it be that their ruins lie beneath ours? That their fossils are not bodies but systems? That we are walking on top of their tomorrow, never knowing? And if that's true, then the Earth does not just remember what lived. She remembers what was imagined. And yet, if imagination can leave an imprint, what else might be waiting, just beneath the clay? The Earth does not speak the way we do, but it does remember. Slowly, patiently, without punctuation. It remembers in basalt and ash, in glacial striations, in the chemical drift of ancient oceans now turned to stone. It writes without ink. It writes without urgency. And yet the story continues. Always. A planetary journal unfolding beneath our feet. A memory that stretches deeper than language, older than myth. Not kept in paper, but in pressure. Not stored in data, but in decay. Perhaps the Earth is not just a place where things happen. Perhaps it is also a thing that notices. Imagine. Each volcanic eruption not just a burst of heat, but a sentence scrawled in lava. Each layer of sediment not just the product of time passing, but of time pressing itself into permanence. Even the thinnest band of iridium, left behind by a meteor long gone, becomes a signature. A single punctuation mark in a chapter of planetary upheaval. What else could that be if not a kind of memory? And the strange thing about memory is that it isn't always obvious. Sometimes it hides in patterns, in isotopes that whisper of different climates, in tiny fossils found in places where they shouldn't exist, in the carbon ratios locked inside limestone, telling us stories of oxygen-rich ages and oxygen-starved ones. The Earth records its own chemistry, its own breath, its own hunger, its own forgettings. Even the things that vanish leave a trace. Could it be that the Earth has been watching herself all along? Not in the way we watch with eyes, with consciousness, but with layers, with density, with unfolding. If a city disappears, its outline remains. Not because the Earth tries to keep it, but because the dust cannot help but settle in its absence. And over time, even the ruins become part of the page. If a species goes extinct, the silence that follows becomes its signature. A gap in the fossil record, a sudden change in pollen, a missing note in the music of life. Absence, too, is a kind of presence. And what of the great extinctions, the global catastrophes? The Earth remembers them differently, in soot, in cooling, in radioactive isotopes embedded like scars. The Permian die-off, the Ordovician chill, the Cretaceous impact that darkened the skies. These are not forgotten. They are encoded, encrypted in the crust, in the deep sediments of the seafloor. Sometimes we find these messages. Sometimes we misread them. And sometimes we don't even know what we're looking at. Because memory isn't neat. It's messy. It overlaps. One layer sinks into another, twisted by plate tectonics, broken by earthquakes, melted by magma, and pushed beneath the sea by subduction. Entire chapters of Earth's history disappear under the grind of continents. But they don't vanish. They transform. Even that is a kind of remembering, a story rewritten in magma, then cooled into something new. Entropy does not erase. It edits. Slowly. Relentlessly. But never completely. What if the Earth is not only a memory holder, but a memory maker? What if every act of erosion, every river carving its way through stone, is not destruction but inscription? Every canyon a sentence, every dune a comma, every glacier a long, cold pause. And if that's true, then maybe we've been living inside a library this whole time. Not one built by hands but by gravity, by wind, by time itself, a place where the shelves are cliffs, and the books are layers of rock, and each line tells of something that once was. Whether it was a fern, or a footprint, or a sky full of ash. Could we ever read it all? Could we ever truly understand what the Earth is trying to say? Maybe, maybe not. But the mystery is not a flaw. It's an invitation. The blank spaces between the known and the forgotten, they are part of the script. They let us wonder. They let us listen. And somewhere, deep within the folds of stone, beneath the oceans, beneath the continents, beneath even our imagination, there may still be stories waiting. Buried dreams of a time we haven't yet guessed. Fossils not of life, but of ideas, of anomalies, of impossibilities. And if the Earth has always recorded everything, even the things we can't yet name, then what else has she saved for us to find? And yet, if the Earth records extinction, what might it remember about the size of a breath, or the weight of something too large to leave a name? The question lingers like mist. Could giants walk the Earth today? Not in myth, not in metaphor, but in muscle, in bone, in breath and stride. Could anything tower above the trees, move through the atmosphere not as anomaly, but as possibility? Or did the world once hold a different kind of balance? A different relationship with size? Maybe the sky we know now is not the sky that always was. Maybe the ground, though it looks the same, once held giants more gently. Because size is not just about scale. It's about structure. A body is not free to grow endlessly. Every cell has weight. Every bone must bear it. And gravity, that silent sculptor, defines what is possible. For every increase in height, weight grows faster than strength. A creature twice as tall is not just twice as heavy, it is exponentially more burdened. Limbs must thicken, muscles must surge, blood must pump harder, lungs must reach deeper. There is a limit. At some point, gravity wins. But gravity hasn't always felt the same. Not entirely. Not everywhere. On a younger Earth, the atmosphere was thicker, denser, wetter. More oxygen, more carbon, more pressure. Insects, once bound to the limits of diffusion, grew to wingspans wider than hawks. Trees stretched taller. Amphibians, unburdened by modern constraints, sprawled in massive proportions. We have the fossils. We have the trace. The ancient dragonfly, Meganeura, nearly the size of a child. The millipedes long enough to ripple like a train. The mammals that dwarfed lions. Not because evolution forgot to scale them back, but because the world invited their size. Could it be that the world was once more forgiving? That gravity, though constant, was balanced by air dense enough to lift more than we expect? Could that softness, that subtle shift in pressure and buoyancy, have opened the door to forms we cannot imagine today? Forms that needed the thick air to breathe, the warm climate to thrive, and the heavier atmosphere to support their massive frames? And what if something larger than any fossil we found once walked beneath that sky? Not a mythic being, but a biomechanical reality, built not in defiance of physics, but in partnership with a different physics. Heavier bones, internal supports, vast lungs adapted to thick oxygen. Slow movement, perhaps. Deliberate, like whales on land, or trees that could think. Maybe they didn't move quickly. Maybe they didn't move much at all. But they could have lived. For a time. In pockets of climate now erased. On high plateaus now sunken. In valleys long flooded or folded into the crust. And as the world changed, cooling, thinning, hardening, those bodies would become incompatible. What once thrived in abundance would falter in scarcity. Oxygen fell. The air grew lighter. The earth grew louder with weather, with wind, with change. A form once viable became a burden. Too big, too fragile, too slow, and so it faded. Not in flames, not in cataclysm, but in slow incompatibility. The way a glacier doesn't fall, but melts. Could some have tried to adapt? Could a lineage have shrunk, evolved downward, trading height for speed, size for survival? We may never know. The fossil record is selective. The soil does not preserve everything, especially not the enormous, the delicate, the ones who were too big to last. And yet, gravity is still here, holding us, guiding trees upward and rain downward. It has always been here, but maybe not always in the same way we feel it. Maybe the context shifted. Maybe gravity was the same, but the world it shaped was more willing. And maybe, in that world, something walked that we would call impossible now. Not because it was fantasy, but because the laws of the world it belonged to no longer apply. So we walk beneath the same sun, under the same stars, held by the same force. But the air has changed. The pressure has lessened. The earth is a little harder now, less forgiving, less soft, and whatever once grew tall enough to breathe the upper canopy is gone. And yet, if gravity once allowed such forms, if the air once lifted more than it does now, what echoes of that forgotten scale might still remain? Hidden, perhaps, in the size of a footprint, or the width of a canyon floor, or a bone too large to name. Sometimes the past does not leave fossils. It leaves ratios, tiny balances, fractions inside atoms, traces of something once whole. While stone tells us shape and bones tell us form, isotopes whisper in code. A softer language, more precise, more elusive, like time wearing a mask. Every element we know, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, lead, carries versions of itself. Isotopes, atoms with the same name, the same number of protons, but just a few more neutrons tucked into the nucleus. Heavier, slower, but still familiar. These atomic variations exist everywhere. Inside bones, inside water, inside ash, and they do not lie. They shift when the world changes. They drift when the climate bends. They spike when something ends. Even atoms remember. A layer of rock in Italy holds a sudden bloom of carbon-13. a moment when the ocean lost its balance, and something enormous died. Another layer in Greenland records sulfur isotopes from a sky gone dark, the breath of a world scorched by impact. These ratios, frozen in stone, are not evidence of what, but of when, of how, of why. They are the fingerprints of extinction, of famine, of atmosphere rewritten by fire. Could it be that every epoch carries its own signature? That each age of life leaves behind a subtle trail in its chemistry? That the weight of a dying forest or the breath of a vanished species can still be measured not in form but in math? Isotopes move slowly, but they move. Through water, through bone, through sediment. A glacier locks them away for a time. A volcano releases them all at once. And across eons, they rearrange the planet's breath. These are not metaphors. These are ratios, quiet numbers. But in their silence there is story. There is a thin layer of iridium scattered across the Earth's crust, where the dinosaurs vanished. Iridium is rare on Earth, but not in space. Speaks not of life, but of collision, of a rock from the stars. And around that layer a shift in carbon, in oxygen, in temperature. Not visible, but real. Even now we find those chemical ghosts in marine fossils, in ancient trees, in shells turned to limestone. We measure. We compare. We ask questions of atoms. Sometimes they answer. And what of the mysteries? The anomalies? The sudden isotope swings in rocks where nothing else makes sense? A spike in beryllium-10 from a burst of cosmic radiation. A faint whisper of plutonium in Arctic ice. Clues that do not yet fit a story. Ratios we do not yet understand. Could they be evidence of something we haven't yet imagined? A mass event without a name? A shift in the sun? Or something else entirely? Maybe, maybe not. But the drift is real. And it continues. Even now, the carbon we breathe leaves traces. The nitrogen in our bodies, the calcium in our bones. All of it returns. All of it transforms. Future scientists, if they still walk this world, will find our signature, too. In the sediments of today. In the fallout of our technology. In the isotopic noise of an atmosphere changed by our heat. We do not pass through the earth untouched. We leave chemistry behind. And so, we listen to isotopes like we listen to echoes, soft, delayed, but persistent. The story is there. Beneath the surface. Inside the elements. Like a note held long after the music ends. And if atoms remember so much, what secrets might still be hidden in their ratios, waiting for us to notice? Could there be a fingerprint we've overlooked, one that does not match any known extinction, any volcano, any war or comet? A trace from something ancient or something immense or something not entirely from here. And yet, if even the tiniest particles recall the shape of catastrophe, what larger stories might still be hiding in the layers that do not burn, but breathe? The ground beneath us is not crowded with bones. Not really. For all the lives the earth has held, every breath taken, every creature that moved through forest, sea, and sky, almost none remain. The odds are not kind. Fossilization is not a guarantee. It is a rare alchemy, a kind of cosmic accident, a lottery with no intention, no fairness, no favor, just chance and silence and timing so precise it feels like fate. Most who fall are forgotten. They decay in the warmth of soil. They're returned to the cycle. Dissolved by bacteria, scattered by scavengers, softened by the rain. Within days, a body can vanish. Within months, even the bones may crumble. And yet, every now and then, something strange happens. The body is buried quickly, covered by ash, by silt, by the bottom of a lake or the weight of a collapsing dune. Shielded from oxygen, protected from rot, and then very slowly transformed. Cell by cell, mineral replaces matter. Bone turns to stone. Time presses in. Pressure seals it tight. What was once alive becomes something else. Not quite death, not quite memory, but something still and heavy and enduring. And so a fossil is born. Not because it was stronger, not because it was more important, but because the conditions said yes. Could it be That entire species vanished without a trace, simply because they lived in the wrong place? In forests too wet, where nothing fossilizes. On hillsides where bones roll and scatter, lost to erosion before the first layer of sediment can form? In deserts where sand is too dry, or oceans where pressure is too deep? Could giants, real giants, have fallen in such places, too large to be missed in life, but too unlucky to leave a mark in death? We will never know how many we've lost to the silence. And perhaps that's the quiet ache of it all, that the fossil record isn't a full book. It's just a handful of words scattered across torn pages, partial map, a broken mirror, enough to suggest a story, but never enough to complete it. And still we read. We imagine. We wonder. And some of the fossils we do find aren't the ones we expect. Not the predators, not the giants, not the kings of their time, but the overlooked. The small. The hidden. A leaf pressed flat in clay. A fish curled in stone like it fell asleep mid-swim. A single tooth, perfectly preserved, from a jaw that's never been found. The fossil record doesn't remember power. It remembers stillness. It remembers whoever happened to be in the right place at the right time when the world decided to keep something. And so the story we tell of life on Earth is deeply shaped by absence, by accidents, by preservation, not by prominence. And this raises quiet questions. What patterns are we missing? What kinds of creatures left no bones at all? What ways of being never stood a chance at fossilization? Were their bodies made of things that don't fossilize, jelly, cartilage, something stranger? Were their lives lived in environments too chaotic, too acidic, too ephemeral to keep their dead? Maybe, maybe not. But every fossil is a survivor of time, even if the being it once was is long forgotten. And when we find them, when we hold in our hand the stone-cast rib of a creature that hasn't breathed in 100 million years, we feel it, that weight, that silence, that astonishing accidental permanence. And it makes you wonder, if being remembered is so rare, so random, what else slipped through the cracks? And yet, if most of life is never recorded, never remembered, never turned to stone, what does that mean for what we think we know, and for the ghosts we haven't yet named? We often speak of the past as if it's behind us, fixed in place, safely stored in stone and sediment. But the truth is gentler and stranger, because even the past is fading. Even memory, when made of rock, slowly loses its shape. Over time, even stone forgets. Mountains crumble, fossils erode, names vanish from the map. Entropy, the quiet pull toward disorder, touches everything, even the things we once thought were permanent. But entropy is not the enemy. It is not destruction. It is a soft, inevitable loosening. It's the breath of time smoothing the sharpness of yesterday. It does not come all at once, and it does not roar. It arrives gently, like moss on stone, like dust in a corner, like water patiently carving a canyon. It does not ask permission. It does not need to. Every memory the earth holds eventually fades. Not because the earth forgets in anger, but because she must make space for what comes next. The ash of a forest becomes the soil of another. A ruined temple collapses into the hillside and becomes part of the hill. The name of a river is lost, but the river still runs. Nothing is truly gone, but nothing stays in its original form. Could it be that even fossils have an expiration? That over millions of years, even the most perfect imprint begins to blur, to crack, to slip back into unrecognizability? That a skeleton once so clear, so defined, can be weathered down to nothing more than a vague curve in a rock face, a shadow mistaken for coincidence? We like to think that stone is forever, but in deep time, forever is just a chapter. Entropy isn't just decay, it's transformation. It's the melting of certainty into mystery. The same process that crumbles bones also creates beaches. The same drift that dissolves ancient cities builds new deltas. Nothing is wasted. Everything moves. Everything leans toward stillness, but not before reshaping the world around it. And so, the story of the earth is not one of perfect preservation, but of constant becoming, of half-memories, of partial truths, of fragments that invite us to imagine the whole. Maybe this is why we wonder, why we reach, why we build stories around missing pieces. Because the gaps are not errors. They are invitations. A fossil tells us what something was made of, but its absence tells us what the world was like when it vanished. A collapsed cave, a broken tool, a single layer of soot, each a whisper, each a fading echo, not loud, not clear, but still present. Entropy does not erase everything at once. It leaves behind hints, clues, just enough to make us curious, just enough to spark a question. Could it be that what we call myth is simply memory, worn thin by time? Could it be that what we call impossible is just the part of the story lost to heat, to ice, to gravity? And what if entropy isn't a mistake, but part of how we remember? What if forgetting is necessary, so that we are always asking, always dreaming, always wondering? What if mystery itself is part of the pattern, woven into the way the universe breathes? Even now, the earth is forgetting. Rain is pulling down hillsides. Wind is softening cliffs. Oceans are grinding coasts into sand. Volcanoes are covering stories with new beginnings. The archive is always being rewritten. And still, something remains. Not in its original shape, not always in stone or bone, but in feeling, in rhythm, in the quiet sense that something came before us, vast and ungraspable. Something we cannot name. Not because it never was, but because entropy has turned it into something else. And yet, if forgetting is built into the very fabric of time, how much of what we see today is already on its way to being memory? And how much of what we dream has already happened long ago and simply faded back into dust? There are places where the wind feels older than the land, where the light drapes the ground as if it remembers a different shape, a taller figure, a different kind of silence. The Pleistocene was not long ago, not in Earth's deep vocabulary. A mere breath before now. But what walked then, and what watched the skies, may not match the stories we tell ourselves. Something larger, something stranger, something both familiar and not. We know the megafauna, the towering mammoths with their spiraled tusks, their warm coats bracing against the breath of ice, the giant ground sloths that lumbered like moving trees, the short-faced bear, larger than any we know today, powerful enough to make the earth tremble beneath its steps. These beings were real and vast and strange, and they lived alongside us, or something like us, because scattered among the bones of mammoths and mastodons are footprints, human or almost human, some small, some wide, some so large they blur the line between realism and legend. Found in New Mexico, in volcanic ash hardened by time, the tracks of tall beings walking beside beasts long extinct. Their stride is steady, deliberate, as if they knew where they were going, as if they had done this before. What if some of them were taller than we thought? Not impossibly tall, but tall enough to feel like myth. Could the conditions of the Pleistocene, richer oxygen, colder nights, thicker nutrition, have allowed some lineages to stretch just a little farther skyward? Could the stories of tall ones passed down in myth be echoes of real encounters, faded through generations into archetype? Maybe, maybe not. But across continents, cultures speak of skywalkers, of tall figures, upright and silent, who came before. Some called them giants, others spirits, others ancestors of forgotten wisdom. And while myth is not science, myth is also not fiction. It is memory processed through language, a way to carry forward a truth that cannot be measured but still asks to be kept. Could it be that in the wild, cold twilight of the Pleistocene, there were people tall, strong, deliberate, who walked across glaciers and tundras, leaving nothing behind but their shadows and their silence? The fossil record, once again, is incomplete. Soft bodies do not always preserve. Ephemeral shelters made of hide and snow melt into nothing. Tools carved from wood dissolve. Bones can break before they are found. And yet, footprints remain. Just enough. A toe pressed into ash. A heel curved into stone. And through those prints, a suggestion that something was here. That something walked. Not imagined. Not invented. Just unrecorded. Entropy has tried its best to erase them, but still they linger, In caves in the Balkans, the oldest known shoes, stitched leather soft as breath. In Tibetan valleys, fire rings older than our oldest cities. In South American rock walls, paintings of towering figures whose heads scrape the curve of the cave's roof. Were they real? Were they symbolic? Or both? The line between myth and being is not always straight. Maybe these beings weren't giants in size, but in presence. Maybe they carried knowledge or stillness or memory from an even older time. Maybe they were the last of something longer, deeper, now gone. Or maybe we have always been them, repeating ourselves in cycles we don't yet understand. And if they did walk the Pleistocene, tall ones with quiet eyes and long strides, then the land remembers them in its own way. In the placement of stones, in the bend of a trail, in the feeling you get when the sun is low and you feel watched but not alone. And yet, if their footprints remain, fleeting as they are, how many others have been swept away? Those who left no prints, only breath in the wind and stories in the stars? Somewhere beneath layers of cooled lava, beneath the patient silence of ancient stone, there are still footprints, not imagined, not carved, not placed, but pressed into molten earth when it was soft enough to yield, and firm enough to hold the memory. Basalt, once a river of fire, has hardened into a kind of diary. Its pages thick, dark, and scattered across the world. In places, that diary opens, and when it does, we sometimes find the outline of a foot, a single step, a heel, a toe, the arch of something that walked, sometimes small, sometimes precise, sometimes strangely large, uncomfortably large, too large to belong to any creature we know, too human to be dismissed, too weathered to be certain. In Tanzania, the Litoli footprints stretch across ancient ash, proof that early humans walked together, upright, side by side, nearly 4 million years ago. Their feet pressed into volcanic dust and were sealed by time. But Litoli is only one place. There are others. More weathered, more debated, more curious. In Nevada, in Turkey, in India, in Texas, foot-shaped depressions in stone, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, sometimes with a stride that seems unusual, too long, too deep, or placed where no foot should be, beneath layers of rock older than any known hominin. Are they misread, misdated, misunderstood, or something else? Could it be that basalt holds more than we've allowed ourselves to believe? That in the cooling of lava, more than heat was captured? A rhythm, perhaps, a moment, presence. We tend to trust stone. We say it doesn't lie, but stone also wears down. It weathers. It cracks. What once was sharp becomes vague. What once was clear becomes debated. And yet, even in erosion, the shape remains. A depression here, contour there, just enough to ask the question. What walked here? Could something large, taller than us, older than us, have stepped across this field when the earth was still young in its cooling? Was there a time when the air was thick enough, the gravity soft enough, for feet this large to walk without harm? Or have we found only illusions, coincidence, natural shapes mistaken for intention? Maybe, maybe not. But still, the mystery holds. Because when you stand before one of these shapes, weathered, sun-warmed, uncelebrated, you feel something. Not proof, but presence. Not fact, but weight. As though the ground is still remembering the moment it was touched. As though the earth has chosen, for reasons beyond logic, to keep this shape just long enough for someone to wonder. And sometimes that wondering is enough, because footprints are not just evidence. They are choreography. They are movement made permanent. They are where body meets world. And the rhythm they leave, stride, depth, distance, is not random. It is memory in motion. Even giants leave a rhythm behind. What if the beings who made these prints were not like us, not entirely? What if they came from a time we no longer include in our timelines? A time overwritten by tectonics and oceans and entropy? What if the fossils of their bones are gone, but their footfalls remain? A few rare echoes. A few lasting steps. And if these footprints are not mistakes, if even one of them is real, then what else might be real, too? And yet, if stone can hold the shape of a single step for 1,000,000 years, what other memories might be waiting beneath the crust? Not in footprints, but in places where silence has weight, and the ground still remembers being soft. There are places on Earth where the trees seem to grow too carefully, where the canopy holds a certain hush, a rhythm just slightly out of place. Beneath the roots of tangled rainforests, in the stillness of swamps and jungles and deserts now buried in green, something waits. Not loudly, not clearly, but with presence, with suggestion, as if the ground itself once knew the shape of walls, of streets, of firelight flickering in doorways now collapsed. Could it be that cities once hummed here, vast and slow and strange, long before our names were spoken? We often think that if a civilization is lost, it must have been small, fragile, brief. But what if that isn't true? What if it is easier to lose the enormous than we think? What if scale is not protection but risk? Because cities are not made to last. Stone crumbles, wood returns to soil, clay dissolves in rain, iron rusts into red forgetfulness. Even concrete, given time, becomes dust. Within centuries, vines reclaim walls. Roots break apart temples. Rivers shift and carry the remains away grain by grain. And before long, all that's left is a pattern in the earth. A strange elevation. A hill that shouldn't be there. A geometry too precise for randomness. And still we forget. In the Amazon, LiDAR scans reveal vast networks. Grids, plazas, causeways, beneath thick forest once thought untouched. In Cambodia, beneath layers of jungle, ancient roads stretch between temple complexes far larger than we knew. In Turkey, entire underground cities lie hidden beneath soft stone. Not tiny caves, but complex systems, chambers, wells, air shafts, passageways carved for thousands. Some are known. Many are not. What if these are not the exceptions, but the reminders? What if there are more? Not beneath forests we've already mapped, but beneath deserts, oceans, ice? Could entire civilizations have risen and vanished in the spaces between ice ages, between floods, between known histories? Not because they were mythical, but because they were misremembered? Maybe, maybe not. But the hum of cities is more than walls. It is rhythm, the echo of footsteps in corridors, the whisper of tools at work, the quiet pulse of light. If there were once cities made of materials we no longer recognize, structures grown or printed or woven from things that decay too quickly, would we know where to look? Would we even know what we were looking at? Sometimes we find artifacts we can't explain. Carved spheres buried too deep. Tools too advanced for their assigned age. Geometric ruins dismissed as natural formations. And always the thin line between archaeology and myth stretches just out of reach. Could it be that some of the stories we call legend, of golden ages, of high towers, of beings who shaped the land, are not fantasies but memories without context? Civilization is not only a product of time, it is a pattern of energy, of organization, of presence. Even now our cities hum, with electricity, with movement, with signal. But if the lights went out, how long would that hum remain? Within months, plants would push through concrete. Within years, glass would break. Within decades, steel would corrode. Within centuries, entire skylines would fall. And in 1,000 years, almost nothing. A few bones, a few plastic fragments. And maybe, if the soil chose to remember, a print of something once square, once bright, once filled with voices. We think we are the first, but the earth is old. So old. And silence is her second language. Could it be that somewhere in that silence, the residue of other cities remains? Not in ruins above ground, but in pressure, in magnetic anomalies, in patterns we haven't thought to measure yet. Maybe what we call ruins are only echoes, and maybe the echoes are still humming. And yet, if voices can vanish from stone, if cities can dissolve into soil, how many more might have lived and died without ever leaving behind a name? The earth is not still. It breathes, not in hours or seasons, but in slow, sweeping cycles that span tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years. These are not breaths we hear, but ones we feel, in the bones of the planet, in the rise and fall of ice, in the floodplains that come and go like dreams. Ice ages are not rare. They are rhythmic. They arrive like tides, cold glacial pulses followed by long, slow thaws. An inhale of snow, an exhale of green. Again and again and again. And in between, something lives. Could it be that entire civilizations once rose during the warmth, then fell beneath the weight of the cold? Not once, but many times? Maybe we are not the first to build with purpose between the glaciers. Maybe we are only the latest breath of warmth between long silences. The ice does not ask permission. It arrives when it is ready, and when it does not preserve kindly. It grinds, it scrapes, it devours. A glacier does not cover, it erases. We often imagine the past as a line, a slope of steady ascent. But what if it's more like a wave, a pulse, a looping rhythm where knowledge is gained, and lost, and gained again, where beings adapt, thrive, vanish, and maybe return in another form, in another warmth. Under the ice of Greenland and Antarctica, there are lakes sealed off for millions of years. Below the tundra of Siberia lie mammoths still holding the memory of fur and flesh. And beneath ancient floodplains, entire landscapes sleep, layered with hints of warmth, of trees, of creatures whose names we never learned. These are not merely frozen lands, they are records. Records of the Earth's deep breathing. Cold, warm, cold again. What if, during one of those long thaws, a people flourished? What if they grew alongside the retreating ice, built settlements at the edge of melting rivers, followed the curve of seasons not unlike our own? And then, the ice returned, slowly, unstoppably, and all that remained was buried beneath its heavy forgetting. Some evidence points to sudden shifts, mini ice ages, climate snaps. A warm world turned bitter in the span of a generation. These weren't always gradual. They weren't always merciful. And for those who depended on the warmth, on the pattern, on the rain that came at the right time, such a change wouldn't just be cold. It would be erasure. Maybe the great floods we read of in myth, the deluges and drowning lands, were memories of real transitions. The end of an age. The sea rising, not just as water, but as silence, claiming fields, stories, and cities alike. Could Doggerland, the sunken plain between Britain and mainland Europe, have held more than stone tools? Could the shelf beneath Sundaland have echoed once with voices now lost beneath the Java Sea? Maybe, maybe not. But the Earth remembers. In ice cores we read the chemistry of the air itself. Bubbles trapped like ghosts, telling us of temperature, of carbon, of change. In ocean sediment we find pollen grains, tiny, persistent, marking the retreat and return of forests. Even isotopes shift with the climate. Even atoms speak of seasons. We are living now in a rare calm, a brief temperate breath between extremes. But this breath is not infinite. And those who lived before us, if they did, might have known that too. Perhaps they built with that knowledge. Perhaps they lived with the understanding that nothing lasts forever. Not even warmth. And perhaps they left nothing behind. Not because they failed, but because the ice came back before we could find them. And yet, if climate itself can erase a people, if the rhythm of glacial breath can swallow entire chapters of history, how many more vanished ages might sleep beneath the meltwater, waiting only for the next breath to begin? Civilizations don't always end with fire. They don't always go out with thunder or sky-shattering collapse. Sometimes they simply fade, quietly, like mist retreating from a valley at dawn. A roof caves in. A garden is left unplanted. A road grows over with moss. Not because of war. Not because of flood. But because someone didn't come home. And then someone else didn't. And then the silence began to take shape. We imagine collapse as drama. But often it's far more subtle. A slow exhale. A soft forgetting. A structure built from wood, not stone, returns to the forest. A city made of clay, not marble, melts back into the riverbank. Even languages vanish this way, gradually, one word at a time. Not because they were wrong, but because they were no longer spoken. Could it be That the greatest civilizations of the deep past weren't marked by towering stone or golden crowns, but by wisdom we would never recognize, by tools made of plant fiber, bone, fungus, light, by systems so integrated with their world that when they left, there was nothing to dismantle, no ruins, no scars, just stillness, just ground, receded. Maybe they lived in ways we would call small, nomadic, rhythmic, ephemeral. But what if that very impermanence was the design? What if their legacy was meant to leave no legacy? No burden, no trail, just an echo of harmony we no longer know how to hear? Entropy again does its part. Soft things don't last. Leather, bark, woven reed. These are not remembered in stone. But that doesn't mean they weren't sophisticated. It doesn't mean they didn't know. It only means they worked with materials the earth reclaims quickly, with systems that decomposed as easily as they were built, with minds that left no monuments, only continuity, for as long as it was needed. And when the ice returned, or the rain patterns shifted, or the rivers broke their banks, these ways of life may have thinned like threadbare cloth. Not torn, just unwoven. Could we miss them entirely? Could we walk above them, on plains, in forests, along coasts, and never feel the shape of what once was? Maybe their stories were etched in sound, in song, in memory, passed down orally until the voices that carried them grew too few, and the rhythm fell silent. Maybe what we call myth is the residue of their science, softened by time, made poetic by survival. We search for collapse in ruins, but what if true collapse leaves no trace? What if the quietest endings are the most complete? A civilization made of sunlight, tide, wood, and ritual may not leave behind a skyscraper. But that doesn't make it less real. It just makes it harder to see. And maybe that's the point. Maybe some collapses are not failures. Maybe they are transformations, adaptations, a choosing to disappear rather than to break. Maybe they faded like dusk, not because they were weak, but because they understood that nothing lasts, that even the most beautiful thing must one day be let go, that silence is part of the pattern, that collapse is not the end, it's the beginning of being remembered differently. And yet, if entire societies can disappear without a scream, what stories might we have already stepped over, never knowing how softly they were buried? There was once a forest taller than any myth. Not the forest we know now, of trees we can name, roots we can trace, but a wilder, older breadth of green. A canopy so high the light forgot how to reach the ground. Trees that rose like pillars into mist, their bark thick as cliff faces, their crowns hidden in a world of wind. This was a forest that remembered carbon differently. A forest that fed on the air when it was richer, denser, swollen with oxygen and heat. A forest before flowers, before birds, before us. Could it be that within that cathedral of chlorophyll something walked? Something not just adapted to its height but born for it? Maybe not giant in mythic scale but in harmony, in proportion, in the way it moved through that green world without need for stone or fire. What kinds of beings could have thrived in such a place? Not in cities but in silence. Not in noise but in knowing. There are fossilized trunks as wide as small rooms. Imprints of leaves larger than our arms. Would turn to stone, but still holding the shape of something impossibly soft. In the Carboniferous period, forests blanketed the earth in vast, wet lowland swamps, towering lycopods, giant horsetails, ferns taller than houses. The air was thick and warm, the ground soft with decay. It was a time of immense photosynthesis, of breath and shadow. And in that shadow life grew large. Insects swelled, amphibians stretched, and the world exhaled oxygen in quantities we can barely imagine. Could such a forest have supported something with a long stride and quiet eyes? Something whose footprint would dissolve into peat, whose bones, if they fell, would vanish into the mulch before time could fossilize them. Maybe they lived in the canopy, where we will never dig. Maybe they never needed fire. Maybe they were light-footed, long-lived, and left no trace because the forest itself was their memory. Even now, some of the largest ecosystems are built on memory. Rainforests regrow based on forgotten seeds. Mycorrhizal networks, fungal threads that run beneath the soil carry messages, nutrients, warnings, and, perhaps, something like thought. Trees communicate, they shelter, they remember which neighbor is kin. They do not speak, but they know. So what else might have known once? And when the forests changed, when the carbon thinned, the oxygen dropped, the great plants fell, whatever lived among them may have faded too. Not in violence, but in misfit, in the slow collapse of a system that no longer supported their breath. Perhaps they didn't die, perhaps they transformed, or withdrew, or turned into myth because no one was left to name them. We often think of evolution as a ladder, but it is more like a garden, branching, looping, full of false starts, soft endings, lost adaptations. There may have been ways of being, ways of seeing, that thrived only in the stillness of the tallest green, and nowhere else. When that canopy fell, they may have fallen too. Not loudly, not forever, but enough. Maybe they whispered to stars through openings in the leaves. Maybe they listened more than they spoke. Maybe they watched the passage of time not in calendars, but in the sway of branches above their heads. And what if some part of that memory is still held deep in the DNA of trees? In the rings that form year after year? In the rhythms of root and rainfall? Could it be that forests dream of their own pasts? Of their height, their density, their songs? And if forests can dream, then what happens when we walk through them now? Are we trespassing on forgotten architecture? Are we ghosts to a world that once held something we no longer understand? And yet, if there were once giants not made of stone or metal, but of bark and breath and soft intention, what else might have lived beneath their shade, quiet, tall, and lost to all but the memory of the wind? Stories, too, grow from soil. Not the soil of earth, but the soil of time, the soil of memory, the stories we inherit, whispered through generations, shaped by tongues long stilled, may not just be dreams or inventions. They may be fossils, not of bone, but of thought, of presence, of witness. What if myths are the shadows of something real, cast long ago across the trembling fabric of memory, stretched and reshaped, but never fully erased? Across continents, cultures whisper similar things. They speak of beings who were taller, older, wiser, of giants who carved valleys, stacked mountains, lifted boulders as if they were seeds, of sky beings who descended not with wings, but with understanding, glowing, knowing, bringing fire or light or sound, of cities beneath the ground, lit without flame, filled with tunnels that breathe and chambers that echo. Could it be that such stories hold more than metaphor? That they are the distant echo of something we can no longer touch, but once, long ago, someone did? In the high plateaus of the Andes, myths speak of Viracocha, tall, white-robed, bearded, emerging from the lake after the flood, walking among the ruins of a forgotten time. In the deserts of Australia, the Dreamtime tells of ancestral spirits, colossal, luminous, who shaped the very landscape with footsteps and song. The Norse told of Jotnar, beings of immense strength and age, neither good nor evil but elemental. The Hopi speak of the Ant People, who sheltered humanity in deep subterranean halls during cycles of fire and flood. Different lands, different voices, but the rhythm repeats. Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe it's the shared scaffolding of the human mind, archetypes, patterns, fears. Or maybe it's more than that. Maybe what we call fiction is a kind of truth that didn't fossilize the way we wanted it to. Not all memory is carbon. Not all records are written. There are kinds of remembering that happen in ritual, in rhythm, in song, around firelight, inside lullabies and morning chants and tales told to children not to explain, but to preserve, to carry forward, to wrap a shape in metaphor when the facts could no longer hold it. Could a myth be a map folded too many times? And if so, what happens when we start unfolding it? There are places on Earth that line up with myth. Places too perfect, too symmetrical, too old. Structures whose origins blur at the edges. Stone laid without mortar, with joints so seamless even time can't find the cracks. Places like Derinquiu, Gobekli Tepe, Nan Madol Tiwanaku. Not explained away, only explained differently. We do not need myths to be literal for them to be real. A story that bends, that changes, that grows with the telling is not broken. It is alive. But alive with what? With imagination, or with the echo of something that once stood where we now find only silence. Maybe the beings in the stories weren't giants of size, but of memory. Maybe they lived long enough to feel like legends. Maybe they built small things that endured, or big things that were meant to be forgotten. Maybe they understood something about time that we don't. Or maybe they were like us, and we are the ones who have forgotten. And what if the myths that seem the strangest are simply the ones we are furthest from understanding? What if the sky beings were not from above but from before? What if the underground cities are not imagined, but buried deeper than we've dared to dig? We cannot date a story told by firelight, but we can listen to its rhythm. And when that rhythm echoes in another land, another language, another time, we might ask why. Because just like fossils, some stories only survive when the conditions are perfect. And many are lost before they can be recorded. But a few slip through. A few cling to the cave walls, to the painted ceilings, to the songs passed down in languages nearly gone. And yet, if stories are fossils of the mind, what forgotten truths might still be alive inside the ones we tell over and over? Not because they're false, but because we've always known, somehow, that they were never entirely ours? Sometimes the earth resets, not out of malice, not with purpose, but with quiet finality, a turning of the page too heavy to stop. One moment a forest sings, the next it is ash. One moment a sea is full of life, the next it is still emptied of breath. And when these moments come, they do not ask for permission. They arrive with heat, with cold, with gas, with silence. Not slowly, but all at once, as if the planet itself inhales and forgets to exhale. Mass extinction is not just death. It is erasure. It is memory undone at scale. 5 times in Earth's history, life has been reduced to whispers. 5 great breaths held too long. The worst of them, deep in the Permian, took almost everything. Oceans turned anoxic, skies filled with methane, forests disappeared. Nearly 90% of species were lost. And yet the planet continued. Quietly, bravely, blankly. What would that have felt like if something had been there to feel it? Not just the dying, but the slow fading of sound? A world once buzzing with wings, with fins, with song, left empty. The fossil record calls it the Great Dying. But fossils do not describe the air. They do not tell us what it smelled like, how the light changed, how long it took for the trees to come back, or if something watched, helpless, waiting. Could there have been witnesses? Survivors not only of biology, but of memory? And then there was the end of the Cretaceous, the one we know best. The sky darkened by dust, by fire, by a single asteroid that struck the sea and made the sky forget how to be blue. Dinosaurs, gone. Not because they were weak, not because they failed, but because time moved differently and chance had teeth. Even this fiery ending left more behind than we expect. Not just bones, but soot in sediment, iridium from space layered across the crust. A line in the stone that says, "Something happened here," and what survived was not always what was expected. Tiny mammals curled in holes, ferns that rose from the ashes, and the quiet things always carrying time forward. Could giants have stood before these endings? Not the scaled or the feathered, but others, those who built or walked or dreamed. If so, their tools would have burned, their shelters shattered, their voices turned to smoke. If something looked up in wonder at the descending fire, no record would remain. No fossil of thought, just the silence after. We speak of extinction in terms of species, but what about knowledge? What about language? What about cultures that existed long before we knew how to measure them? The Earth may have held them, and then let them go, because when the planet resets, it does so without sentiment. Volcanoes open, Oceans rise, temperatures swing, the air thickens or thins, and the web of life reshuffles. What was once dominant becomes forgotten. What was once peripheral takes center stage. It is not fairness. It is not cruelty. It is change. And yet, within this cycle, there is pattern. Extinction clears the stage, yes, but it also allows for new actors. From the shadow of the last ending comes new light. After the Permian came the age of reptiles. After the Cretaceous, the age of mammals. And each time, something different emerged. Something the world had never seen before. Could it be that even extinction is creative? That it is not an end but a shift? That beneath the sorrow of loss, there is always a flicker of becoming? And if that's true, if even death on the scale of worlds makes room for life, then what lives might we still be missing? Lives born in the wake of disaster. Lives too short-lived, too soft, too strange to be found. What if the sixth extinction, the one many say is now unfolding, will one day hide our stories in the same way the fifth did theirs? And yet, if life can vanish all at once, leaving only a line of soot in the rock, what unseen stories might already lie buried beneath our feet? Forgotten not because they failed, but because the sky, once upon a time, decided to begin again? Not all fossils are bones. Some are entire moments, entire ecosystems, entire silences, preserved in the stillness of stone. Beneath the dry beds of ancient rivers, in the middle of deserts that once were seas, under volcanic ashfalls hardened like memory, forests still stand. Not living, but not entirely dead either. Trees that once reached toward sun and sky now turn to quartz, to jasper, to opal. Still upright, still rooted, but no longer wood. Their cells replaced by minerals atom by atom over millions of years. Their rings intact, their bark unchanged, their breath held forever. A petrified forest is not a grave. It is a pause, a suspended exhale, a living moment so abruptly stopped, and so perfectly preserved, that it became more than memory. It became monument, but not a monument to death, a monument to the continuity of time. Could it be that these forests were once home to beings we've never imagined? Not just trees and ferns and giant insects, but something more? Something that moved among the trunks with soft eyes and heavy thought? Something that knew the trees not as obstacles, but as kin? We'll never know. The ash didn't keep the footsteps. The mud didn't hold the breath. But if entire forests could fossilize, maybe something else did too. Hidden, buried, misunderstood. In Arizona, a stone forest spans nearly 100,000 acres. Trunks lie scattered like fallen columns, stripped of bark, crystal-filled, gleaming with the colors of iron and silica and time. They fell over 200 million years ago, and they've been lying there ever since, unmoving, unchanging, unmistakably still. Not wood anymore, but something else. Not alive, but not quite gone. In Patagonia, there are forests so old their stone roots are deeper than our continents. In Egypt, beneath drifting sands, lie petrified stumps that once stood where now there is only silence. These were not lone trees. They were parts of entire worlds, biomes that stretched, that breathed, that sang in ways we cannot reconstruct. We have their trunks, but not their undergrowth, not their winds, not the animals that rustled their leaves, not the languages, if any, that once passed between them. And yet, they remain, not because they were the strongest, but because something covered them at the right moment. Sediment, time, entropy, interrupted, and in that interruption, a kind of eternity. Could these forests have seen beings we'll never name? Could their roots have cradled the bones of creatures that decayed too quickly, or never died in the right place, or simply didn't leave behind the parts we know how to look for? Maybe the fossils we find are the ones lucky enough to have been preserved, but what of the ones who moved too lightly, or lived in places that turned to salt, or never fossilized at all? Petrified silence is still a form of witness, a kind of geology that doesn't speak in shape, but in presence. When we touch these ancient trees, we are touching time itself. Time in crystalline form, solidified breath, hardened memory. They are not telling us everything, but they are telling us something. And sometimes that something is a question, a pause, possibility. What if there were beings who slept at the roots of these giants? What if they lived not above ground, but beneath, sharing the soil, the mycelium, the nutrient web? What if they never needed cities because they already had forests? What if their homes, their tools, their thoughts were built of things too soft to last? We search for bones. But maybe we should listen for stillness. And yet, if forests can turn to stone, holding shape for millions of years without a whisper, what else might lie just beneath them, quiet, unseen, and waiting to be remembered not in form, but in the hush between rings? For every fossil we hold, for every bone in a museum, there are thousands, millions, never found, never formed, or never seen. The earth is vast, and most of it remains unread. The story we know is only the one told by pages that haven't burned, haven't eroded, haven't slipped into the sea. The rest is silence, or soft suggestion. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. It is a question, an opening, an invitation to wonder. Could it be that in some forgotten canyon or deep silted trench, the bones of something lost, something unexpected, are still resting, still intact, waiting for just the right erosion, just the right eye, just the right moment to come to light? We've explored so little. The rainforests hide what they cannot fossilize. The ocean floors hold layers we may never reach. The deserts bury, then reveal, then bury again. Winds moving over dunes like careful hands redrawing the past. What lies beneath the Antarctic ice, sealed for eons beneath a frozen lid of secrecy? What waits in limestone caves yet unmapped, in the hollows of mountains untouched by excavation, in riverbeds that dried before we arrived? Maybe there are bones we've already found, but misunderstood, filed away, mislabeled, attributed to something familiar because the alternative seemed too strange. Maybe we've seen pieces of a puzzle but lacked the lens to recognize the picture. Or maybe the bones aren't bones at all. Not every being is made to fossilize. Some forms decay too fast, leave no calcium, no structure. Some move too lightly to press the earth. Some live in places that preserve nothing. And some may have chosen to disappear without residue. But even without bones, there are other ways to leave a trace. Isotopic shifts, mineral irregularities, unusual sedimentary patterns, anomalies in magnetic readings, in fossil gaps, in suddenly vanished species with no predator to blame. Shadows in the data, questions too easily dismissed. Could these be hints? In the deep ocean trenches, the hadal zones that fold into the earth like ink into parchment, life exists that we've never seen. Bioluminescent, soft-bodied, untouched by sunlight. What if something larger once swam there? Something ancient? Something that still does? We cannot know what we haven't looked for, and we haven't looked everywhere. And then there are the places we can't even imagine searching. Caves collapsed into themselves. Volcanic islands formed over older layers. Continents that have drifted. Subduction zones where the crust is swallowed whole. Entire ecosystems erased from the record not by time, but by geology. Could it be that what we think of as the fossil record is not a record at all, but a scattering? A few fragile pages from a book mostly burned? Still, we search. Because in the searching, we remember that there is more to know, more to feel, that the past is not closed, it is only quiet, and that every now and then, something speaks. A jawbone, a tooth, a single vertebra, curled in stone, a pattern in the rock that doesn't match the others, a hollow space where a skull once lay, now filled with crystals, now sparkling with the memory of presence. And yet, if so much has already slipped through our hands, what else lies beneath? Waiting in the hush between epochs, in the forgotten folds of the world, where no one has yet thought to look. What if the earth doesn't just hold memory, but has memory? Not metaphorically, not in stories or fossils alone, but in form, in rhythm, in pattern. What if the planet loops her thoughts, not in words but in recurrence? Shapes repeated, destinies rehearsed. What if some echoes are not coincidence, but resonance? There is a whisper in science, still tentative, still softly held at the edge of what we claim to know morphic resonance. A theory that suggests nature remembers. That once a thing is done, it becomes easier to do again. That form has memory. That memory shapes form. That somewhere, beneath the biology, beneath the physics, there is something else. A field. A blueprint. A pattern that hums softly beneath the matter we can see. Could it be that the Earth has played out this story before? That giants, cities, forests, oceans have all come and gone not once, but many times? That we are not the first to wonder, not the first to build, not the first to lose? When we look across time, we find parallels. Organisms that emerge in separate eras but carry similar design. Crabs that evolve, disappear, and then re-evolve. Wings that appear across species with no shared ancestor. Eyes that form again and again, as if the planet is trying the same ideas over, refining them, forgetting, then remembering again in a slightly different way. Not because of lineage, but because of the shape of possibility. Is it possible that Earth holds an unconscious memory of what works? That the same geometries rise from different roots because the planet remembers them, like chords struck again after silence? Not consciously, not deliberately, but deeply, in stone, in pressure, in the language of minerals and breath. Even in our cities, we repeat. We build circles. We arrange in grids. We return to pyramids, to spirals, to sacred ratios. Some say these are mathematical necessities. Others say they're aesthetic instincts. But maybe, just maybe, they are echoes of something older, not learned, but remembered, like a dream that visits generations long after it should have faded. Could there have been a civilization 10 million years ago or 100 that reached and fell, whose only remnants are not physical but vibrational? Ideas embedded not in artifacts, but in the field of the earth itself. Ideas that resurface unclaimed, through dreams, through architecture, through instinct. Maybe we are not copying each other. Maybe we are all reaching for the same remembered shapes, drawn by something deeper than culture. The planet has changed its skin many times. Oceans have opened and closed. Mountains have risen and collapsed. Continents have drifted apart and rejoined like slow tectonic breathing. But underneath the surface, there is always something circular, something returning, an old note, replayed in a new key. And in these circles, there may be messages. Strange signals picked up in sediment, rhythms in magnetic reversals, anomalies in isotope layers that suggest not randomness but intent. Could these be the scattered remnants of forgotten Earths? Earths that began, bloomed, disappeared, and then tried again? We call this Earth our home. But what if she is also an author, writing, erasing, revising her own story across geologic chapters too vast for us to fully read? What if each age is not an accident, but a stanza? What if life, in all its forms, is a refrain? Maybe our memories are not only ours. Maybe we dream what the Earth remembers. And if that's true, if the planet holds more than stone and sea, if she holds the memory of shapes, of echoes, of choices once made, then what happens next? Are we following a path walked before? Will we vanish only to be half remembered in a future mind? In a future rhythm? Will someone else rise from the silt and wonder, as we do now, if they were the first to wonder? And yet, if the Earth does indeed loop her thoughts, what if we're not living at the beginning or the end, but somewhere in the middle of a memory just starting to return? Time, as we measure it, moves forward hour by hour, year by year. But the Earth thinks in epochs, vast chapters separated not by clocks, but by changes so profound that they leave scars in the crust. A line of soot, a shift in isotope ratios, a sudden disappearance of coral or pollen or bone. These boundaries are not sharp like paper cuts. They are soft, gradual, and yet they are unmistakable. Something ends, something else begins, and in between silence. The silence between epochs is not nothing. It is not absence. It is potential, a breath held too long, a question not yet asked. These are the quiet interludes where the planet resets, where old species fall and new forms stir beneath the surface, where ice retreats and seeds awaken, where ruins soften into hills and the air changes its composition, almost imperceptibly, until it becomes something else entirely. Could it be that in these gaps, between the Devonian and the Carboniferous, between the Triassic and the Jurassic, between the Cretaceous and what came after, there were entire worlds that slipped through? Civilizations or creatures or ways of being that did not last long enough or loud enough to fossilize, that lived only in the stillness between dominant voices, perhaps not for millions of years, but long enough to wonder, long enough to rise and fall without leaving much behind. Geologists call these transitions boundary events. They study the lines where one era gives way to another, where the sediment changes color, where the chemistry of the earth shifts, where one form of life vanishes and another explodes into being. But what if these boundary lines are more than scientific moments? What if they are doorways, not dramatic, not lit with fire or flood, but quiet thresholds between forgotten realities? Maybe the giants slept in these spaces. Not necessarily giants of body, but of thought, of time, of presence. Maybe in the lull between catastrophes, something woke, briefly, beautifully, and then lay down again as the next age began. Maybe some forms of life are not built for the long march of eras, but for the delicate hush between them. There is something sacred about thresholds, the moment between night and day, the place where forest becomes plain, the breath between inhale and exhale. In these liminal spaces, the rules loosen, patterns pause, memory reshuffles. Could it be that the earth, too, has liminal spaces in time, places where the past and future hesitate, where the fabric of reality softens, where things happen that do not fit neatly into the timeline we've drawn? We search for continuity, we draw straight lines, but the earth writes in ellipses and pauses, in stops and starts. And in those stops, perhaps, are the things we cannot see, not because they are hidden, but because they existed in silence. There are rocks where fossils should be, but aren't. Intervals of missing data, gaps in evolutionary history, sudden appearances, abrupt disappearances. Could the silence between epochs hold more than we allow ourselves to ask? Maybe we're not meant to find everything. Maybe some stories were written only to be felt. Maybe the quiet between the layers is not empty, it's listening, waiting for us to slow down long enough to hear what it never had the chance to say. And yet, if these silent spaces are real, these soft boundaries between the known and the forgotten, then what might lie just on the other side of the silence we're standing in now? Some bones belong to animals, others belong to ideas. Not all skeletons are made of calcium. Some are made of copper wire, melted silica, etched metals arranged in impossible precision. Some are tiny coils lost in sand. Some are lenses cracked by time. Some are plastics tangled in the roots of old rivers, their surfaces eroded not by use, but by memory. These are not the fossils we've been trained to find, but they are fossils all the same, technofossils, the residue of intention, of thought made durable, of design that outlived the hands that made it. We're beginning to see them now, traces of ourselves embedded in the strata of the modern Earth. Layers of plastic in Arctic snow, radioactive isotopes spread evenly across the crust, synthetic polymers fossilizing into rock, strange alloys resistant to decay. Our era, brief as it may be in the scale of deep time, is already writing itself into the stone. We are becoming a layer, but could we be just one of many? Could it be that the Earth has seen other layers like this before? Other brief flames of intelligence that burned just long enough to leave behind a trace too odd, too unrecognizable, too easily dismissed? Perhaps a chip of worked metal in ancient sandstone, a polished sphere found too deep, a fused mass of glass and rare earths beneath an otherwise natural plane. We have found such things. We call them outliers, curiosities, anomalies. We place them on shelves or bury them deeper, because they don't fit. But maybe that's the point. What if some civilizations don't leave temples or texts, but only residue? What if they lived lightly or ended suddenly, or made tools that blurred too easily with nature once they fell into decay? What if we've already uncovered pieces of a past so strange, so divergent from our own, that we didn't recognize them as history. Could there have been batteries before Baghdad? Could there have been composites lost beneath volcanoes? Could something have shaped metals long before fire was said to be mastered? Maybe, maybe not. But possibility has weight. It lingers. It settles into the ground like sediment, invisible until the right question brushes it free. We find manufactured objects deep in peat bogs, embedded in coal seams, sealed in ice. We explain most of them, but not all. And still, there are stories of machines that no longer function, tools that serve no modern purpose, pieces of engineered form where no blueprint should exist. We call them OP-arts, out-of-place artifacts. Maybe they are mistakes. Maybe they are frauds. But maybe they are memory's residue, too old to be accepted, too new to be forgotten. And what of the objects we've lost ourselves? Satellites in decay, spacecraft in orbit, drones buried in deserts, technology left in oceans, in caves, in mountains. One day these too may seem impossible. Stripped of context, separated from language, they will seem like offerings from a world that doesn't align with the record. They may become the myths of a future species, or the evidence of a past no one remembers being part of. Could it be that we are the technofossils of tomorrow's mythology? Some bones rust, others hum, some carry current, some decay slower than the hills they rest in. And when we find them, if we find them, it may not be their age that matters, but their strangeness, their refusal to fit the story. Maybe ideas too fossilize, not the thoughts themselves but their structure, their casing, their external logic made material. A tool is an idea hardened into matter. A machine is a sentence built from gears. When these collapse, they leave bones behind, skeletons of lost possibility. And sometimes we find them, and yet, if ideas can leave fossils, and thought can outlast flesh, then how many other dreams have been buried in the earth, still humming softly beneath layers of time, waiting for us not to understand, but to recognize? There are places where the land seems to look back at us, not in metaphor, not in imagination, but in shape, in the gentle slope of a hill that forms a nose, in the jagged cliff that curves like a brow, in the long ridge of a sleeping spine stretched across a horizon. Sometimes the rocks resemble faces, not because they were carved, but because they were formed, wind-sculpted, time-polished, shaped not by hand, but by patience. And still we see eyes. Pareidolia, they call it. The mind's need to find meaning in pattern, to see the human in the inhuman, to bring face to stone. But what if it's more than that? What if the earth, too, has memory of us or something like us, and leaves these silhouettes as a way of dreaming in reverse? Could it be that long before we gave mountains names, we gave them stories? And that those stories came not only from the minds of people, but from the land itself, inviting the story to be told? In every culture there are sacred mountains. Sacred not just because they are tall or dangerous or beautiful, but because they feel alive, because they feel aware. In the Andes, the Apu spirits are said to dwell in the peaks, watching over villages, whispering through snow. In Japan, Mount Fuji holds the still breath of divinity. In Australia, Uluru rises from the plain like a sleeping heart, red, round, and endlessly old. And in countless mythologies, the earth is not dead matter but living form. Gods turned to stone, ancestors sleeping in the cliffs, beings who once walked but chose instead to lie still and become landscape. Maybe these weren't just stories. Maybe they were perceptions tuned differently. Maybe people once listened more closely to stone. Maybe they didn't see faces where there were none, but recognized something we've since forgotten how to see. The earth moves slowly, but she does move. Rock flows, plates shift, valleys deepen, and in that motion forms emerge. A mountain may take the shape of a face not by coincidence, but by rhythm. A silhouette may form in a canyon wall not because we wish it so, but because some memory, buried in basalt and quartz, once asked to be remembered. We are made of the earth, our minerals, our metals, our salt, So maybe when we look at a mountain and feel that it sees us, we are feeling the reflection of something ancestral, something geological. Maybe we are not projecting humanity onto stone, but glimpsing the part of stone that still remembers being alive. And what if some of these forms are more than accidents? What if some of the mountain faces, those that align just so, those that seem too precise to dismiss, were shaped, not by erosion alone but by intention now lost? What if ancient beings, long before what we know as history, sculpted stone not to dominate but to disappear, to become the mountain, to blend into geology, to last? A monument you don't know is a monument cannot be vandalized. It cannot be stolen. It simply watches. It waits. We may never prove such things, but the feeling is real. When the mist moves a certain way, when the light strikes a peak just right, when the trail turns and the slope above you is not just slope but brow, cheekbone, chin, you feel it. The gaze, the presence, not threatening, just old, just aware. And yet, if the mountains have faces, and the land remembers form, what other stories might lie hidden in the folds of the earth? Not as ruins, but as watching things, still and silent, waiting for us to finally notice they were never sleeping at all? After the giants fell, whether of bone, of breath, of stone or sky, the wind must have changed. Not loudly, not in protest, but subtly, the way absence reshapes space. The way a once-occupied room breathes differently once the voice inside it is gone. There must have been a moment, or maybe 1,000 years of them, when the forest felt the shift, when the rivers flowed a little more freely, when the canopy stopped listening for footsteps it would never hear again. Ecological succession is the long, slow exhale of the earth healing herself. Not as a return, but as a rearrangement. After collapse, after fire or flood or silence, life returns, but not as it was. The soil forgets some things and remembers others. New plants take root in the places that were scorched. Ferns unfurl where trees once towered. Lichens appear on stone, then moss, then grasses, then forests again. But not the same ones. Never the same ones. Could it be that the stillness we now walk through, the quiet groves, the soft prairies, the gentle coasts, were once echoes of endings too old for the ground to name? Maybe the silence that followed the fall of giants wasn't emptiness, but recovery. Not erasure, but reprieve. The earth given a moment to rest, to breathe, to rearrange her threads. And what bloomed in that calm was not lesser, just quieter. More subtle, built not for scale but for endurance. For renewal, for softness. And in that softness new worlds emerged. In the hushed gaps between vanished thunder and new birdsong, species found a way. Fish explored waters left cool by melted glaciers. Trees stretched into skies cleared of ash. Small creatures with careful eyes stepped into lands once occupied by shadows too large to see them. We think of dominance as permanence, but sometimes it is the quiet that lasts. And perhaps, if there were giants, real or imagined, their absence shaped more than just the air. Perhaps the land still curves in their memory. Valleys that once cradled their sleep. Waterfalls that once mirrored their faces. Hills that rise not randomly, but as the softened echoes of shoulders that once stood there. The calm that came after may not have been mourning. It may have been renewal. Ecological succession doesn't just repair, it transforms. It writes new rules from old wounds. After the last great extinction, it was fungi that surged first. Decomposers, digesters, the cleaners of memory. Then came the ferns. Then came the seeds. And then, eventually, the creatures who could carry those seeds further. Could it be that this calm, this layered, lush, slow rhythm of regrowth was itself a kind of wisdom? That the earth learns with each collapse not just how to heal, but how to deepen. To grow not only upward, but inward? Even now, when a fire clears a forest, it does not stay barren for long. Pioneer species arrive. Soil rebuilds. Birds return. And the songs that rise in that reborn silence are different, slower, maybe, but resilient, measured. And maybe the rivers did change their tune. Maybe they sang to new banks, softer ones, carved not by stampede but by rain. Maybe the wind did sound different through the grasses, no longer interrupted by bodies too tall to bend. Maybe the stars were reflected in still ponds instead of eyes, for the first time in a long time. And yet, if stillness can grow where giants once walked, what other songs might be waiting to bloom in the places we have not yet listened, where silence is not absence, but the prelude to something new? And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? What lies just beneath the soles of our shoes, beneath the roads and gardens and quiet hills? Where time sleeps under layers of moss and memory, we walk without knowing, across fields, along shorelines, through forests and cities, our feet moving gently over what once was, not just bones, not just stone, but lives, echoes, possibilities, forgotten forests, extinct oceans, civilizations with no voice left to speak. Every step we take is a soft trespass across someone's forever, and the earth remembers it all even when we don't. Sometimes the ground gives us clues. A femur buried in clay, a shell caught in limestone, the imprint of a fern too delicate to survive, but too stubborn to vanish. These are the whispers, the lucky fragments, but most of it, the vast, unspoken everything, stays hidden, ground down, subducted, scattered into particles that drift like breath into the layers beneath our lives. Could it be that the place where you now stand was once a temple floor, or the bottom of a shallow sea, or the clearing where something we can't name once stood tall enough to catch the moonlight in its eyes? We do not know, not because the evidence is weak, but because time itself is too deep to hold in one lifetime. Geology tells us that the crust of the earth is layered like a book. But unlike a book, the pages aren't bound. They tear, fold, slip, collide. Some are rewritten in magma. Some sink beneath continents. Others are erased by ice, wind, water, and time. Still, sometimes, a ghost of a chapter remains, buried beneath basalt, or held in the twisted grain of petrified wood. Maybe even beneath your street or your home. We don't always know what we're walking on, only that it is old and sacred. It's strange to think that beneath a child's sandbox might rest the grave of a mammoth, or that beneath a subway tunnel, bones older than humanity wait in silence. Not because they are haunting us, but because they are part of us. We are layered creatures, born from the sediment of all who came before. Maybe that's why certain places feel different. A grassy field that feels heavier than it should. A cliffside that seems to watch you. A cave where sound bends and you're not quite sure why. Perhaps it's memory. Not our memory, but the Earth's. Perhaps the ground holds emotional gravity. Not in metaphor, but in resonance. In the way atoms remember. In the way decay creates something almost sacred. And maybe, just maybe, walking is a form of remembrance. Even when we don't know we're doing it. Maybe the bones beneath us aren't forgotten at all, but felt, subtly, in dreams, in stories, in sudden awe, not because they cry out, but because we're quiet enough sometimes to hear what's already there. We often think of graves as endings, but the earth treats them differently. Here, burial is not the final act. It's the beginning of transformation. Bone to stone, wood to coal, ash to soil. Time doesn't stop at death. It moves through it, folding every loss into the tapestry beneath our steps. What if every trail is a thread? What if every path we walk is braided into the story of the ones who came before? Not just the humans, but the trilobites, the tree giants, the feathered things with teeth, the cities made of mud and sun and songs we've never heard. All of them still here, beneath. And when we walk, maybe we're not just moving forward. Maybe we're walking backward, too, into memory, into deep time, into silence. So the next time you take a step across the earth, whether it's concrete or sand or stone, pause, feel it, the quiet underfoot, the hum, the weight, not heavy, but eternal, presence. And yet, if we walk upon such graves with every step, what new worlds might one day walk across the bones of us? The ocean is quieter than we think. Not because it is silent, but because its voice is slow. It speaks in currents, in pressure, in the hush of silt settling like sleep upon the forgotten. It does not scream. It does not argue. It remembers in stillness, and it buries in grace. Beneath the waves, there is a world that does not age the same way ours does. Down past the coral and the drifting light, down into the twilight where colors lose their names, and deeper still into the black pressure zones, lies a record not of pages, but of sediment. Crushed bone, sunken wood, glass from stars, stone from cities. The sea swallows memory with kindness, but not without trace. Could it be that entire epochs live beneath the seafloor, hidden in layers we may never touch? Whole lands once above sea level, now dissolved, shifted, or drowned by rising tides and falling time. Islands that once echoed with laughter or prayer, or songs too ancient to translate, may now rest beneath thousands of meters of forgetting, not because they failed, but because the sea has always been a collector of bones, of ruins, of myths. There are places where sonar flickers, and something strange echoes back. Patterns beneath the sediment that resemble stone walls, or circles, or staircases. Maybe, maybe not. The ocean is both generous and deceptive. It reveals only what it chooses. Shipwrecks made of bronze, tools made of obsidian, forests turned to peat, deep below the Dogger Bank. The sea doesn't lie, but it doesn't explain either. Geologists tell us that the continental shelves, those vast shallow ledges bordering our continents, were once dry land. During the ice ages, sea levels were hundreds of feet lower. Forests grew where whales now swim. Rivers carved canyons where sharks now drift. Could it be that civilization once followed the coastlines of a different world? One now erased not by fire, but by waves? And what about the bones? The ones too delicate to fossilize, the ones pulled apart by currents and crustaceans. Bones of children, bones of giants, bones of creatures we no longer name. In the sea, entropy is soft, dissolution is slow, but even there traces remain. Isotopes in fish teeth, pollen in deep-sea cores, carbon layers like whispers on the seabed. These are the footprints of forgetting. We think of the sea as untouchable, eternal, but it is just as shaped by time as the mountains. Ocean floors are recycled through subduction, pulled into the Earth's mantle, melted into magma, reborn as volcanic rock. Even memory has a melting point. Even water can become fire. And yet, even in this endless process of burial and rebirth, the ocean leaves clues. In the Mariana Trench, we find microplastics. In the deep mud of the Black Sea, preserved wooden ships. In sunken canyons, the shadows of rivers long vanished. Perhaps, somewhere in the Pacific or the Indian or the once glacial South, there rests a city we've never known, people we've never met, a story not yet remembered. We must wonder. If the earth writes in stone and in dust, perhaps the sea writes in silence, in rhythm, in loss. Maybe the legends of Atlantis, Mu, or Lemuria are not lies, but echoes. Not because they were real exactly as told, but because the ocean has always made storytellers out of those who dream. And we are dreamers still. The sea does not shout. It does not keep archives or scrolls, but it holds bones in its sand, tools in its trenches, seeds in its stillness. We have only just begun to listen, to lower robotic arms into the abyss, to pull cores from the seabed, to map the contours of memory that lie beneath the tides, slowly, gently, like waking up inside someone else's dream. And so we float above it in ships or satellites, listening for patterns, searching for meaning, hoping that, in some soft layer of blue-gray clay, something stirs, a fossil, a fragment, a word that outlived its speaker. And yet, if even the sea remembers what we have forgotten, what more might lie just beyond the reach of light? Somewhere in the strata of silence, deeper than oceans and older than myth, the earth holds a mirror. It does not reflect faces, but epochs, not moments, but movements. And if we peer long enough into its slow, sedimentary gaze, we may find something unexpectedly familiar. something shaped like us, but not quite. A curvature of bone, an arrangement of limbs, an intelligence tuned to a different rhythm. Not us, not exactly. But perhaps what came before, or what waits beneath the dust. Looking into deep time is not like looking into the past. It's more like walking through a dream we didn't know we had. In the Cambrian, life was soft and strange. Creatures without eyes, bodies built like kites or spirals, ecosystems that bloomed before the first tree had even imagined standing tall. In those silent shallows, what would we look like to them? A fantasy, a monster, a god, or nothing at all. We think of evolution as a ladder, but the earth prefers spirals. Shapes repeat. Eyes evolve, dissolve, and return. Wings appear where fins once ruled. Teeth sharpen and then vanish. Maybe life doesn't forget its favorite ideas. Maybe it just wears them differently each time. The trilobite's armored form, the ammonite's golden spiral, the symmetry of the sea lily. Echoes of design ripple forward, even as the bodies themselves erode. And then, somewhere in this long unfolding, something walked. First as lizard, then as ape, then as us. But if we could go back, further back, before fur, before fire, before fear, would we know ourselves? Is there a point, deep in the fossil record, where we would feel an eerie kinship with something nameless? A shape pressed into shale. A ridge of skull. A curve of hip bone. Something that feels like memory. Could it be that the earth tries again and again to shape minds that can wonder? That can sculpt stone, sing to the stars, or fear their own forgetting? And if so, how many times has it succeeded only to be erased? Not by war, not by fault, but by time. The great silencer, the soft resetter, the patient editor of history's margins. There are fossils that blur the line between what we know and what we expect. Hominin bones found where we didn't think they should be. Tools too advanced for their layers. Footprints in volcanic ash that seem too modern, too knowing. We explain them. We must. But explanations don't always quiet the wonder. Or the feeling of déjà vu, as if the earth has walked this path before. As if we are not the first to lift our gaze and ask, what am I? Some researchers speak of convergent evolution, the idea that certain forms are inevitable. That wings, eyes, even social minds might emerge again and again wherever conditions allow. If true, then maybe deep time is a hall of mirrors. Maybe we are just the latest reflection, and not the last. We measure time in years, but Earth counts in layers, in isotopes, in decay. In the slow drift of continents, the rise and fall of forests, the breath of glaciers as they come and go. Against that vastness, a human life is a spark in the dark. And yet, here we are, looking back, listening forward, tracing our fingertips along the edges of creatures who lived before dreaming existed. We are not so different from the ancient ones. We too nest and sing and hunt and dance. We too carry stories in our bones. Could it be that some part of us remembers the Devonian reeds, the Triassic salt winds, the Pleistocene chill? Not as fact, but as feeling. A murmur, a hunch, a longing. There are moments, standing beside the fossils of beings that no longer walk this world, when the air grows still, when time folds, when the mirror tilts, and in the twist of a rib, or the slope of a jaw, we see a question reflected back. Who are you, really? Not because we are the end of evolution, but because we are its continuation. This pause, its breath, this next sentence, not yet finished. And yet, if the earth keeps shaping minds to wonder, who else might be looking back through time at us? The dust remembers shapes, but not names. It keeps the curve of a jaw, the reach of a limb, the shadow of a footprint pressed into ancient clay, but not the sound of their laughter. Not the feeling of their questions, not the dreams they whispered to the sky. And so we ask, what makes a giant? Is it mass? Height? A skull too large for any helmet we've known? Or is it something quieter? Something unmeasurable? Something that lingers only in the hush between stories? Perhaps a giant is not a body at all, but an echo. Not because it stood taller, but because it meant more. because someone remembered, because someone told a tale. Maybe the bones are gone, but the myth remains. And maybe, just maybe, the myth is the more accurate fossil. A fossil of the mind. A memory that refused to erode. Cultures across continents, unlinked by trade, yet dreaming in similar shapes, told stories of tall beings who walked before us. Who taught or ruled or watched or vanished. The Norse had frost giants. The Hopi had the Palaquapi. In Africa, in India, in the islands of the Pacific, giants rise again and again. Not because they were seen, but because they were felt. Felt in the forests that once grew thicker, in the stones that stand upright without reason, in the uncanny proportions of relics that shouldn't fit any known hand. Could it be that identity isn't just biology but belief? That a thing becomes real not when it is measured, but when it is mourned? And if so, what else have we made real simply by needing it to be so? Memory, too, is a kind of body. It grows, it decays, it adapts, and it forgets. But it forgets selectively, letting go of the mundane, preserving the meaningful. And what is more meaningful than a mystery? A question that won't dissolve. A face too large for explanation. A footprint too deep for the soil it rests in. We remember giants not because we saw them, but because we needed them. Because we needed to know that someone else came first. That someone else tried to reach the stars and failed. Or vanished. Or ascended. Or became the wind. Could it be that giants were never meant to be literal? That they were metaphors wearing muscle? Reminders carved in scale? Not beings of bone and sinew, but symbols of lost ambition, of the parts of ourselves that dared to stand taller, and paid for it. Maybe they were warnings. Maybe they were hopes. Maybe they were us. We measure identity in categories. Species, age, size, behavior. But the Earth has never cared for categories. It erases labels as quickly as it erases footprints. What it preserves is rhythm, pattern, silence. What it holds onto are the things that resist classification. The outliers, the anomalies, the myths. There is no unit of measurement for wonder, no isotope to trace belief. But still we try, still we dig, still we listen, not with ears but with imagination, hoping that one day the dust will speak clearly, that it will tell us not what lived but what mattered, not what died but what was loved. And perhaps that is what identity truly is. Not a name, not a lineage, not a set of coordinates on a family tree, but a memory wrapped in meaning, a dream left behind in stone, a breath that traveled so far through time that it no longer remembers its source, but still stirs the leaves when we pass. Maybe a giant is anything that makes us feel small in the right way, not because we are less but because we are late. Because we arrived after something vast and vanishing, and we sense it faintly in the wind, in the rocks, in ourselves. And yet, if stories can fossilize, what other shapes might we be walking through without even knowing? Somewhere beneath the drifting sands, beneath the folding pressure of seabeds and silt, beneath the hush of glaciers that do not scream but simply press down year after year, we may already be becoming myth. Not tomorrow, not someday, but now. Now, as we type, as we breathe, as we drop a tool or a footprint, or a microplastic shard into a place we'll never return to. Maybe, to eyes not yet formed, we are already gone. Already strange. Already giant. Because myth is not always born from size. Sometimes it grows from distance, from absence, from misunderstanding magnified by longing. What remains of us when the language is gone? When the signs corrode and the satellites fall and the symbols we chiseled into silicon become unreadable, what will they make of us? Those quiet someones, soft-browed and curious, crawling through the dust of what we believed would last. Maybe they won't know our names, but they'll find our echoes. A buried highway like a ribcage cracked open. A concrete skeleton nested inside a hill. A rusted arc of bent titanium, mistaken for ritual or shelter or spine. And maybe, when they measure us not in blood or breath but in the weight of what we left, they will think we were immense, towering, incomprehensible. Not because of our kindness, not because of our art, but because of the volume of our residue. Could it be that we are already giants, not of stature but of scar? There are isotope trails in our atmosphere now that did not exist before we walked it. Carbon signatures curling like fingerprints in the air, whispering of combustion and cities and heat. We've salted the soil with particles it never asked for, sowed the ocean with polymers that never rot, pressed our weight into every layer of the Earth's skin. So much so that geologists have whispered a name for us, a new epoch born of our influence, the Anthropocene, not because we were noble, but because we were loud. And yet, beneath all that noise, will anyone hear us? Not the words we meant to last, but the ones we forgot. A child's drawing in the back of a buried drawer. The curve of a spoon designed not for function, but for beauty. The way light bent across glass in our old windows. These are the kinds of things memory holds onto. Not the monuments we meant to leave, but the accidents. The moments. Is it possible we were never meant to be remembered clearly? Perhaps remembrance is always distortion. Perhaps, to be remembered purely, one must become unclear. A blur in the fossil record. A question in the bedrock. Maybe we are the question. Maybe that's all we've ever been. Maybe that is enough. Because the Earth is patient. It does not archive in hours. Collects in epochs. And we, so fragile, so temporary, have written ourselves in chemicals and combustion. In glass and decay. In ruins not yet ruinous. We are already layering into her memory, slowly, with the entropy of all things proud. So what will they see, these future watchers? A race that thought itself clever, or a species that dared to burn too brightly? Will they see gods, or fools, or both? Will they think our aircraft wings were feathers? Will they believe our cities were nests? Will they kneel before the fossilized imprint of a circuit board, mistaking it for a relic of prayer? Or maybe they will never find us at all. Maybe we will dissolve more quickly than we imagined. Our metals drawn into the sea. Our concrete cracked and consumed by root and time. Our names eroded to silence. Maybe, long from now, we will be only a rumor the Earth once told herself. A half-remembered dream she had, about creatures who made machines that forgot them. And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might still be sleeping beneath our feet, waiting to be misunderstood again? And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? Even stone, which seems so permanent, so certain, so sure of its place in the world, says goodbye. But not quickly, not with a shatter or a scream. Stone does not leave like fire or flood. It lingers, it erodes, it dissolves itself grain by grain, molecule by molecule, whisper by whisper. Stone has all the time in the world, and still, it does not stay. There is a kind of grief in this, but not the sharp kind. It is the grief of slow surrender, of edges rounding off, of sharpness yielding to the wind, again and again, until it becomes something else entirely. A mountain becomes a hill, a cliff becomes a slope, a boulder becomes a pebble, becomes sand, becomes dust, becomes nothing. And even then the dust travels, carried by air, by ocean, by footsteps. Always in motion, always in farewell. What if stone was never meant to be eternal? What if permanence was just our illusion, a projection of our need for anchors, for memory, for things that don't slip away? But even the oldest stones, the ones buried deepest, the ones pressed by kilometers of pressure and heat, they too are not forever. Subduction zones drink them back down into the earth. The planet swallows its oldest stories, melts them, rewrites them in magma and new rock. Nothing escapes the loop, not even stone. And so the earth forgets itself, deliberately. Geology is not a static archive. It is a living erasure, a record written in disappearing ink. Lava flows crust over fossils. Plates crash and fold memories into mountains, only to grind them down again. The land changes shape not because it is broken, but because it breathes, because it grieves, because it lets go. And yet, in that letting go, stone tells its tale, not in words but in patterns, in sediment that remembers the rhythm of an ancient sea. in mineral veins that echo the pressure of collapse, in erosion lines drawn like wrinkles across the face of time. Even the cracks have their language. Even the emptiness left behind is part of the message. It's not about what's preserved, but what remains just long enough to be noticed before it, too, fades. Could it be that memory was never meant to last forever? That the beauty is in its decay? Entropy is not cruelty. It is not loss for the sake of loss. It is the soft folding of time into itself. It is what allows the old to make space for the new. Without it, nothing would move. No fossils would form. No oceans would shift. No mountains would crumble into fertile soil. We owe everything to what disappears, maybe even ourselves. And so when we walk among stone, through canyons or coastlines or ruined temples, we are not walking through permanence. We are witnessing farewells. We are touching slow goodbyes. We are hearing, in silence, the earth say, "I was here. I am going. I will be something else." Maybe that's what makes it sacred. And what about the monuments we've carved? The statues, the towers, the faces cut into cliffs. Will they last? Maybe for a time. But stone keeps no promises. Rain will fall. Salt will crystallize. Ice will pry the cracks wider. Wind will carry atoms away. Not because it hates us, but because that is what time does. It smooths. It dissolves. It lets go. There's something humbling in that. That even our grandest declarations, our temples to selfhood, our cathedrals of pride, are just temporary ripples in the earth's crust. That even the sharpest chisel cannot compete with a patient breeze. And perhaps that's how it should be. Perhaps the long goodbye of stone is not tragedy, but mercy. Maybe it is a lullaby for the earth itself. A slow return to stillness. A soft unmaking of form. A peace made not by ending, but by becoming everything else. The cliffs will fall. The statues will fade. The words etched in granite will blur into nonsense, then into nothing. And still, the dust will remember. The sand will whisper. The atoms will carry on, folding themselves into new hills, new echoes, new quiet stories. And maybe, far from now, someone else, soft-footed, wonder-eyed, will walk those hills and wonder who we were. And yet, if even stone says goodbye,